now called the Creative Corps and MC Publications, after being released from prison and operating out of his apartment at 685 1/2 West Wrightwood Avenue, allegedly sending photos of the boys to a Dawn in Canada. In a raid of the apartment, 20,000 pink index cards, or possibly 50 to 100,000, containing the names of customers, were found. They would not let me keep renting the U-Haul. In 1977, while Norman was still in prison, the victim who testified against Norman, leading to his conviction, the names of customers were found. They would not let me keep renting the U-Haul. In 1977, while Norman was still in prison, the victim who testified against Norman, leading to his conviction, was stabbed to death while walking home. The primary person of interest in this murder is the next moving part to come into play, a man by the name of Philip Paskey. Paskey was a career criminal and sex offender known for his proclivity towards violence. He worked as the manager of MC Productions' mailing operation, and took over the whole operation temporarily while Norman was in prison. Paskey was described as being Norman's closest associate and second in command. He was also described as being tall with bad skin and a pockmarked face, as well as having a tendency to cross-dress. He also had a tendency to inexplicably not go to prison. Despite a very long criminal record, the charges
scalloped edge, so the one agarot piece will fall into the neck of the broken Coke bottle and perfectly block it. And you can make a chillum which is, you know, will destroy a tent full of 30 people. And this is modern ethnopharmacology. I know there are urban anthropologists among us, so these are the things which need to be documented. Anyway, it was thought...
That's usually a combination of cannabis and tobacco, then?
And tobacco, almost always.
Which in itself is a whole other...
Yes, an MAO inhibitor and all these things.
The tobacco is the MAO inhibitor?
It is a strong MAO inhibitor, yeah.
What's MAO?
Monoamine oxidase. This is the system in your brain which is inhibiting monoamines, meaning serotonin is a monoamine, but so are all these drugs. So if you take a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, the monoamines no longer oxidize, and oxidation is their way of being inactivated. So if you take an MAO inhibitor and then one of these drugs, it doesn't go away. It just goes on and on and on and on until your monoamine oxidase system reasserts itself and quenches the drug effect. And there are powerful monoamine oxidase inhibitors. There are monoamine oxidase inhibitors which will inhibit every molecule of monoamine oxidase in your entire body, to the point where it takes 23 days to build back up to normal MAO levels. Most MAO inhibitors are not so violent. For instance, harmine is what's called a reversible MAO inhibitor. It inhibits MAO for 4 to 6 hours and then is degraded by that pathway. Continuing on around the world, looking at these shamanic hallucinogenic drug complexes, I mentioned Soma in India, probably Amanita muscaria in the opinion of Gordon Wasson. I think that it's more likely that it was a stropharia. And I will talk about the mushrooms when I get to Latin America, to Central America. But it's important to remember that their point of origin is believed actually to be Southeast Asia, to be, in fact, Cambodia. And they seem to have a very old symbiotic relationship with the white cattle, the cebu, the tropical cattle, which developed in that same area. At Non Nok Tha in northern Thailand, they have found graves, Neolithic graves, 15,000 BP, with the bones of Bos indicus intermingled with human bones in human burials, and with some of the bones of Bos indicus with burned out centers, indicating a chillum, the use of it as a chillum. Obviously bones were the first chillums. But no mushroom use is known to survive in Asia, although in the interests of completeness, there is a curious situation going on in what used to be called New Guinea, which is now West Irian in Indonesia. There is it was very puzzling. There were tribes high up in this mountain valley who took mushrooms. And when they took the mushrooms, they behaved as though they were possessed. And it looked to people as the reports began to filter out, aha, another mushroom cult, and Gordon Wasson and his people went and made extensive collections. And the problem was that the mushrooms, a number of species were indicated in this folk way, and none of them had any discernible psychoactivity at all, and no chemical analysis showed anything happening. So then they went back through it much more carefully with linguists. And what this means, they went through it much more carefully with linguists, is they asked the people, said, why do you do this? These mushrooms don't do anything. And they said, oh, we know they don't do anything, but you can't run amok unless you've taken them. And it turned out it was a cultural permission thing. It was that the expression of extreme dissatisfaction and rage was to be always preceded by the ingesting of certain mushrooms. And no one knew why. And it may be a memory of a mushroom cult, or it may be totally unrelated to the normal acquisition of vision states from drugs. Who can say?
But other mushrooms in Nepal, and there's a lot of them there now.
Well, there are once psilocybin was located and noticed as a metabolite of Basidiomycetes, then they began looking worldwide, and they find them everywhere. It's called synchronicity, and it's just called a necessary, because the world exists, this must happen, so this exists. But what are you to say when it happens 20 times an hour? What seems to be happening, and what would certainly challenge science tremendously, is that under certain conditions, mind can become a force in the environment through the intercession of drugs. Now, at first this idea may sound outlandish, then at second pass it sounds pedestrian. It sounds like it's just a new way of describing magic. You're saying what magic is mind as force in the world. I think that's true, but what interests me is, what are the limitations of this, and how can one take control of it? The ego does not seem to be the controller of the force. The controller behind the buildup of coincidence is not the ego, but it is like the ego. Perhaps it's the superego. Whatever it is, it has some kind of overview of events, and it can move the situation in different directions. So when you take the drugs, this is why I said earlier this morning, I sit still in darkness, because I don't want to send waves out into the world that can be returned to me as affects, because it just becomes too strange. You know, you discover that the world really is made of language, and if you discover this too fast, it will undo you, because you're part of the world, and you don't want to discover that you are also only made of language, and then draw the appropriate conclusions from that, and then, you know, where would you be left? So you have to proceed carefully with the project of deconstruction. As to what the psychedelic state is in itself, if we can speak of an in itself and a for itself of the psychedelic experience, it seems to me that it must be, it's a dimension. It's a higher dimensions are very hard to talk about, but it's some kind of higher enfolding of space which you occupy. This morning I made the metaphor of that it stands the shaman in eternity. This is a way of saying that there is a dimension which encompasses all time, but which stands behind it, but which can somehow be entered via the drug. The reason I think this is true is because I think you can look at all of evolution as a conquest of dimensions. This is what is actually happening. Like the earliest forms of life had only a tactile sense. They got no information about the world except about those objects that were in direct contact with their surface, and then they encountered them as resistance. That was the readout these primitive organisms got. Well, then they developed photoactive spots on their bodies so that they could register electromagnetic input from a higher dimension, photons falling on the environment. Previously a datum unavailable to biology suddenly became available, and a difference was established between light and darkness, and animals could move toward the light or, into darkness, or this sort of thing. Then that sets those photoactive patches that convey the impression of light and darkness set the stage for the development of the eye. And the eye presupposes a real conquest of distance, because you're actually coordinating information that is not immediately present. What it is, if you analyze it very carefully, is it's ahead of you in time. When you look with your eyes at something, what you are doing operationally is looking into the future, because you are going to then set your legs in motion and walk toward the thing seen and confirm for yourself its existence. And time is passing while you are walking toward this object. You are walking toward the thing beheld a moment before. So you see, your eyes are further ahead of you in time than any other sense. And with bipedal motion and binocular vision, we're getting ever finer and finer coordination of three-dimensional space. And we know the primates have the best coordination of three-dimensional space of any animal group, and they achieved it by leaping from tree to tree and swinging from limb to limb and achieving this marvelous coordination within a three-dimensional access. The leap to the next dimension, which is not a spatial dimension but a temporal dimension, occurs through development of an entirely different set of mechanisms. We're no longer now talking about coordinating bipedal motion with the eyes. We're talking about keeping the past present somehow so that it doesn't go away, and finding out about the future and having it also in the present somehow. And for this you need language and grammar with tenses. And so this whole quasi-biological mechanism is developed, which allows a further conquest now of time. Now we no longer live in a kind of a shimmering eternal present, but we have a history, and a geological history, a planetary history, a meta-history. We have a future and a planetary future and a meta-future, and we squeeze all this down. We say, we know where we are. We're halfway from the Big Bang to God, and we're well coordinated. Now, what is happening is, with the hallucinogens, yet it turns out there is yet another level of ingression into the mix of being, a previously entirely unanticipated level, as unanticipated as a level as history was unanticipated by the creature with the light-sensitive spot. It was a great task for it to conceive of light and darkness, let alone the notion of a universal cosmic history. And what the hallucinogen, and this is why, recall that I said that the tryptamines are so much like brain chemistry, and the beta-carbolines as well, which are the compounds in ayahuasca which inhibits the MAO. They occur in the living brain. In fact, the compounds in ayahuasca and the compounds in the living human brain are so close as to be essentially co-mappable. What this means to me is that actually, without the presence of psychedelics per se, we are evolving into this dimension that I'm talking about, that is the dimension beyond history, beyond three-dimensional space. In fact, this is what religion is. This is what ecstatic experience is. These are anticipations of a future state of humanity that we are moving toward. Who was it? Wordsworth, Keats, somebody wrote in Ode to a Grecian Urn, Intimations of Immortality. That's what it is. It's a growing intimation of immortality. If by immortality we mean this strange, all-inclusive, previously invisible dimension of information which the psychedelics are making accessible. And I think that, we have come to a funny place in this process, a place where a person like me and people like you can sit in a room and I actually articulate the process. I say, this is what's happening, but you see, it's always been happening. History is the clue to the fact that the monkeys are undergoing some kind of rollover. And it takes 10 or 15,000 years for the rollover to occur. And we're, 3/4 of the way through it. So by this time, things are very strange. Everything is up for grabs. What's normal is not normal. What's secure is not secure. But the psychedelics anticipate this future state. Now, what is it, and why should it lie further along the evolutionary pathway? I think the answer to that is that as an animal evolves, the pressure is on filtering information so that the important information gets to the brain centers that need that information to keep the organism alive. So the filters which are evolved in the evolutionary process lay a tremendous stress on immediacy, quickness of response. How fast can you detect the attacking object? How fast can you perceive pain, heat, all of these things? So consequently, as an animal evolves, there is a maximizing of data about the immediate space and a minimizing of data about ever more removed points in space. I mean, a monkey evolving on the planet Earth needs no information about the galactic center. So if evolution proceeds by some kind of process of economy, all information about the galactic center will be winnowed out. It isn't necessary. Nevertheless, there seems to be in the physics of being this idea that all information is co-present everywhere. It's just that if it doesn't have biological efficacy or confer some advantage, it's not going to be easily accessed. But strangely, as a species or a culture evolves, the information that qualifies for efficacy changes. So that now we are a historical society, or we're not a troop of primates moving through the treetops. We're a high-tech society with the a deep knowledge of our history and an intense anticipation of our future. So we exemplify this process. We see it happening in ourselves, and we have use now suddenly for this information in these previously hidden realms. And this is why we are gaining information about more and more abstract areas. We know now about the center of the atom, about what the processes that operate on the surfaces of stars, and what's going on in black holes. All this we have deduced, but we also have it in our heads in a way. And as the cultural economy changes in relationship to information, this information will be revealed and used. And shamans are simply like leaders. They're just going first. They're explorers. They live where we all will live, and they always have done that. I think they've always been ahead of everyone. And but this passing into a higher dimension is a very strange thing, because it's going to be imperceptible, yet it's the major change in our lives. It's an internalized change. We are not all living in the same historical moment. You know, some of us are living in the early 90s, some of us probably in the mid-60s. I mean, people cling to preferred points in the historical continuum, but this psychedelicizing of the self, this ability to hold an image of eternity in your mind, waking or sleeping, this ability to hold an image of the planet in space, the history of the species, the correct relation of everything in the cosmos, that's what this higher sense is. And it's causing history and will obviate history. And that's why it's very important. And that's why the hallucinogens are so controversial and fraught with energy of different sorts for different people, because they are actually the thing which made us human, and they are the thing which is going to make us more than human. And they are part of a flowing stream. They don't, they're not tolerant of stasis. So to the degree that anyone forms an attachment to some static situation or concept, the psychedelics will abrade that and dissolve it, unwind the pattern, and take it away.
How do you can, what you're talking about in the beginning, this morning, you said that you made a reference that your life is a certain way now and you like it that way. I don't know what that means to you, but right away I went into what that might mean to me. I know you're married and you have children, and how does this stasis that you're talking about and hallucinogenics, how do they relate? How do they live with one another? I shouldn't say stasis as one way.
No, but it's a very good question. Well, I think it's always been said that the path is a razor's edge, that you can fall too far to one side or the other. And the trick is to know what you're getting into, so that you make your choices with open eyes. I have contacted, these states of being which are like siren songs. You just say, my God, this is so impelling that I want to always be like this. I don't, and some of them are titanic. Like, for instance, one of the odd things in the Amazon, when you take mushrooms, that at first I thought was delightful, and then I actually came to see it as actually a weird kind of danger, so that it always made me a little uncomfortable, is you're sitting stoned on mushrooms, and this idea gets hold about how you had previously misperceived the jungle, and actually the jungle is the natural home of man, and the jungle is the mother, and you begin to get a picture in your head of a way you could be that would fulfill you but not be human. It would be life in the canopies. it would be the life of a psychedelic super ape. You know, if the evolutionary thing had turned another way and we had developed philosophy the way we developed science, then we would move in troops through the trees in contemplation of the absolute outside of history. History need never have happened. And, you know, you're just thinking away on this, and yes, it sounds pretty good, and what are the conclusions to be drawn? And they are, you know, that you are choosing to sit here doing this. You're choosing to play botanist, ethnopharmacologist, American citizen, father, lover. You're choosing to do all this. It's okay to choose to do it, but you are choosing to do it. It is not a fate. You aren't set into it. You could just right now, just get up quietly and walk toward the green and keep moving. Now, what would happen to you if you did that? The orthodoxy says night would fall, the mosquitoes would gather, and you would die within hours, if not days, of madness induced by insect bites, if not being chewed on by some large animal. But the state says no. It says, you know, as you're leaving behind your humanness, you're leaving behind all these assumptions. You know it doesn't work like that. You know that the cutting edge of being is will, and it is going to be the way you will it to be. And I've never tested the limit of this thing, but I've seen briefly people do things where they willed it the way it was to be, and it bordered, you know, on the uncanny. And this is what the feats of super balancing that are in Carlos Castaneda, tricks on waterfalls and that kind of thing. This is where you say, you know what I can do?
Level 5 Shadowheart, best prepared spells. Now that Shadowheart has reached level 5, she gains level 3 spells, biggest power spike so far, can prepare 8 spells, up from 7, has 2 level 3 spell slots, meaning she can cast 2 of these per long rest. Still has access to all level 1 and level 2 spells, so we need to balance her spell prep. Step 1, reviewing her existing spells. Your previous 7 prepared spells were Healing Word, bonus action healing, Keep, Bless, party-wide attack and save buff, Keep, Command, enemy control, Keep, Spiritual Weapon, bonus action melee summon, Keep, Hold Person, paralyze enemies for auto crits, Keep, Silence, shuts down spellcasters, Replace, Lesser Restoration, cure poison, paralysis, etc. Silence isn't as needed now that you have Spirit Guardians as a strong control spell. We'll swap it out for something better. Step 2, best level 3 spells to prepare. You can now prepare 1 more spell, and you have 2 level 3 spell slots per long rest. We should prioritize game-changing spells that make the most of those 2 slots. Best level 3 spells for Trickery Cleric. Spell? Why pick it? Spirit Guardians. Best cleric spell at level 5. Deals radiant necrotic AoE damage every turn while slowing enemies. Huge battlefield control. Heals multiple allies as a bonus action. We keep Healing Word for individual healing, but this is amazing for party-wide recovery. Why these? Spirit Guardians turns Shadowheart into a walking damage aura. Mass Healing Word ensures she can revive multiple allies in a pinch. Step 3, final 8 prepared spells. Now that you have 8 slots, here's the best spell list for survivability, healing, buffs, and battlefield control. Level spell, why keep it? Level 1, Healing Word, best emergency heal, bonus action. Bless, party-wide attack, save buff, best level 1 buff. Level 1, Command, forces enemies to drop weapons, flee, etc., battlefield control. Level 2, Spirit.
10. So then, for person, less. Now it's this depends on the amount players for the okay. When to not use less.
Hexshat. When to use Bless versus Spirit Guardians versus Hold Person Concentration Juggling Guide, you're 100% right. The biggest challenge with Shadowheart or any cleric is knowing when to use what concentration spell. Bless is amazing, but it can't always be the right choice, especially now that you have Spirit Guardians and Hold Person. Step 1. Understand each spell's purpose. Since you can only have one concentration spell active at a time, we need to pick the right one based on the fight type. When to use it, when to skip it. Bless. Before the fight or turn 1 if allies need accuracy boosts. Skip it if enemies are already close, use Spirit Guardians instead. Spirit Guardians. When enemies are rushing you or clustered up, turn Shadowheart into a walking AoE nuke. Skip it if enemies are far away or dying quickly. Hold Person. Against single strong humanoids, bandits, drow, cultists, where you can guarantee crits. Skip it if there are multiple enemies or if the target has high wisdom saves. When to use Spirit Guardians instead of Bless. You should use Spirit Guardians over Bless when enemies are already in melee range of Shadowheart or will be soon. You're fighting a horde of weaker enemies, more targets with more damage. You need AoE damage more than accuracy buffs. Your team doesn't need extra accuracy, i.e., they already have high attack rolls. If the enemies are already closing in, casting Bless is a waste. You need Spirit Guardians. When to use Bless instead of Spirit Guardians. You should use Bless over Spirit Guardians when the fight is just starting and enemies are still far away. You're against a few strong enemies instead of a horde. Your allies are struggling to land hits, low accuracy, multi-attacks like Extra Attack or Eldritch Blast spam benefit most. You expect your team to take a lot of saving throws. Bless helps with this. Spirit Guardians doesn't. Bless is a pre-fight buff. Spirit Guardians is an in-fight damage dealer. When to use Hold Person instead of Bless or Spirit Guardians. You should use Hold Person when you're fighting humanoid enemies, bandits, cultists, enemy NPCs. You're fighting a single powerful enemy rather than a horde. Your melee fighters can immediately follow up with critical hits, Lae'zel, Karlach, or Asterion. The enemy has low wisdom, or you're willing to take the risk on a save or suck spell. If the fight is small and strategic, Hold Person can be the best choice. Final easy guide, before combat, Bless if there's time. Enemies rushing you, Spirit Guardians, big AoE damage. One humanoid boss, Hold Person, lock them down. If you don't know what to pick, default to Spirit Guardians unless enemies are far away or it's a boss fight. Let me know if you want a more specific fight scenario breakdown.
Better take a peek.
Can't give up now. Have to keep going. What's in here? What's inside?
Someone's got a knot in the tree. Don't be shy.
All right. What now?
Hey, soldier.
Time to press ahead. Open up. still alive, so that's progress.
I can do almost anything I want to do, and then proceed to go out on the razor's edge and perform these things. And they challenge, the ontological definition of humanness. The thing that we were investigating when we went to the Amazon challenges the ontological definition of humanness. What we were looking for, we had heard reports that in very off-the-river situations, in these very unacculturated tribes, that people, shaman taking ayahuasca, vomited an exotic material that was somehow, it was like a part of their body. It was a regurgitatable magical organ of some sort that they then looked into this stuff and could see. It was their means of divining. It was how they found lost objects, how they saw the future, how they performed all their magic was by means of a psychophysical fluid generated inside their own body. Well, this is either, big news or absolute madness. There's very little room to maneuver with a notion. It all begins to distance us. The way atomic forces bind metallic atoms in a matrix, we all believe the same thing because there are thousands and thousands of us here, all packed closely together, all more or less believing the same thing. If you go off into isolation, you're like an electron moving out of a metallic matrix. Suddenly you're no longer bound by the rules that govern the mass phenomena of metallic atoms. Suddenly you're subject to a new set of laws, and you discover reality is very malleable and can change right in front of you. And then with the addition of psychedelics, you discover, that language is the leading edge and that it can be projected into the world. Then the trick is to learn, how to do this
The
without
boar grunts and eyes you
becoming
warily
unbalanced,
with its beady eyes.
how to do it without hurting other people, and finally how to do it and actually help people. But it's a
The boar
strange
shuffles
notion,
its trotters,
and it's been
unsure.
tugging at the human experience probably since before history, probably for the past 20 or 30,000 years. There has been, this, in the peripheral vision of the collectivity of the species, the awareness that mind is a very funny thing, and that put through the mill with psychedelic drugs, very interesting things can happen. The user of these psychedelic plants, he lives in, his world has much greater reality for him than the world of modern physics has for the people who practice modern physics, because it's an experiential world, and yet we dismiss it entirely, as a kind of a psychologism, a kind of delusion. But it's because we are so certain that language secures the ground of being.
This reminds me of what I'm mostly interested in. You mentioned those imprints, the fact that the plants have helped the apes gain a new dimension of consciousness, and probably doing it a little faster than they would have probably done it. I don't know if you're familiar with Sean Gebser's 5 stages of development of consciousness. I'm not so much into that. I've become lately interested. I only know of the 5 stages, They're the archaic into magic, into mythic, into mental, and into transcendental consciousness. And the idea of the transcendental consciousness being the new consciousness that could have happened to a certain individual sometime way past in the history or someone in the future, but it happens gradually to everybody. The whole race is going through these stages of transformation. His idea was that they happen in the form of mutations in consciousness, which we can find correspondences in when you get into the genetics of it. But I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, so that at least this was pretty much of a new insight to me. I thought that it would happen only naturally as a result of genetic mutation, that you begin to tap maybe not higher but different levels of consciousness.
Well, no, I don't think so. See, the human animal hasn't changed very much in 50,000 years. What seems to be happening is once you have culture, then change is transferred out of the genetic realm and into what's called the epigenetic realm. And so though the human animal has changed, suddenly culture is mutating very, very rapidly, in fact, just furiously shedding new forms. I'm not familiar with the person you mentioned, but I know a theory which sounds like it sort of parallels this is Julian Jaynes' theory that he puts forth in his book, The Origin of Consciousness in the Bicameral Mind. And what he says there is very interesting. He says that up until fairly recently, up until maybe Homeric times, circa 1400 BC, everyone heard voices. And that in fact people were sort of like animals, except that when they reached a decision point, they would appeal to God, and God would tell them what to do. And it wasn't always God. Sometimes it was the king, sometimes it was the dead king. But anyway, everybody had in their head a button they could push marked, give me the answer to the question posed. And he deduces this by studying certain passages in the Iliad and other things like that. But then he says, this phenomenon could only exist in a situation where civilizations were not in contact with each other, because traders going from one city-state to another, from Ur to Chaldea, we'll say, would notice the fact that in Ur, everybody heard the king's voice in their head. In Chaldea, everybody heard the god something or other in their head. And so these early merchants realized the relativity of religion and essentially invented the ego. They discovered that the voice which was giving people direction could become the self in some, that what had previously spoken from above could actually be integrated and become the self. Well, we now all are like this. We have all passed through this cultural transition. None of us, I hope, but too much, hear voices which give us directions. We don't do that. We ask what we call our conscience, our self. It's always accessible, and in fact, we call it me. Say, well, let me see what I think. We don't say, let me see what the king thinks. The king has become us. This previously autonomous psychic function has been claimed for consciousness. Well, how many of these ascents are possible? How many of these godlike hidden sources of information through a process of slow historical transformation can become so familiar that they become indistinguishable from me, and I then identify? So what James is saying about Homeric man is that Homeric man became Homeric God and actually bootstrapped himself to his ideal. The same sort of thing may be happening with the confluence of psychedelics and cybernetics. In other words, a God is evolving on this planet. It's a cybernetic God, and Julian Jaynes He talks about this. He makes a very interesting case. He says, in Chaldea, people believing that when they had a question they needed to listen to the voice of the king in their head is not greatly different than millions and millions and millions of people having their consumer choices, the clothes they wear, the food they eat, the churches they attend, dictated to them by mass media. Taking mass media seriously is like being demonically possessed by some kind of collective organism. So, but I'm more optimistic than that. See, I think that the mass media is a very transitory phase of the cybernetic revolution, and that what is actually happening is that an overmind is coming into being, which is a human collectivity, and it is a
in a holographic sense that all these little parts are merging into
that all the information is beginning to flow. All the information is accessible at any point in the matrix, that each one of us can now access the Library of Congress shelf list, the New York Times data file. We are becoming universalized. A supermind is coming into being, and just beginning to come into being, and we may have 50 years or so of relating to it as distinct from us. But obviously, very quickly, as the way we manipulate our machines becomes more natural, and we're pointing our way towards the thought-manipulated machine that is implanted behind your ear at birth, something like that. At that point, the cybernetic overmind of the species becomes